Let us pop our headlights. We must remove ticks and place them outside in the sun. We ask foreign nationals to pack their belongings and be sent back. Now, these remarks by South Africa's Zulu King Goodwill Zwelithini, reportedly made to a cheering crowd, have been linked to the latest wave of xenophobic violence to hit South Africa. King Zwelithini insists, however, his statement was taken out of context. But violence appeared to break out soon after he spoke. The attacks on migrants began in Durban, in South Africa's KwaZulu-Natal province. It then spread to the suburbs of Johannesburg. At least 7 people have been killed in the worst wave of anti-immigrant violence to hit South Africa since 2008. Now, the stabbing to death of a Mozambican citizen in broad daylight in full view of cameras in the Johannesburg township of Alexandra has shocked the world. The South African government deployed troops there to the flashpoints to quell the violence, but over 800 people have been arrested and the tensions remain high. The attacks provoked anger in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Zambia and Nigeria, collectively known as the frontline states, owing to the role they played during South Africa's liberation struggle. Thousands of nationals from these countries have been evacuated. South Africa now faces a backlash from across the continent. In Mozambique, about 200 protesters there blockaded the southern Limpopo border and stoned South African vehicles. In Zambia, a privately owned radio station has stopped playing South African music in protest. In Malawi, South African-owned shops are forced to shut after calls from locals for a boycott. So what next for South Africa? Well, the South African government has thrown all its weight behind the efforts to quell the situation in the country. This week, President Jacob Zuma held a series of meetings with South African ministers and community leaders to address issues surrounding migration and the well-being of foreign nationals.
The South African government sprang into action this week in the wake of xenophobic violence. President Jacob Zuma met with senior ministers and community leaders to address decisive issues surrounding migration and the well-being of foreign nationals. It's all part of a drive to minimize the damage to the country's reputation. The talks held on Wednesday were constructive following the attacks in 2008 and in January this year. President Zuma freely admitted that things could have been done slightly differently.
Yes, we are confident that it will work. You will, of course, be aware that when it happened in 2008, we adopted a certain approach. We had interactions, we talked to everyone, we talked to communities, as well as the foreign nationals. We talked to the UNHCR, the United Nations that deals with refugees. We did what we thought was enough at the time.
An interministerial committee on migration has been formed and tasked with addressing concerns across the country. While the meeting with the various sectors was billed to deal with migration issues, it was actually about xenophobia. The government has adopted a multi-sectoral approach to the problem.
Government are also understanding that they need to embrace the other sectors in addressing the problem. It's not just the government that can step in and solve the problems here. It's a collective effort, and at least if we know what the drivers are that are causing the problem, we can start addressing those.
Government has come out at a top leadership level to condemn and to go out and take action. I think an act such as the President cancelling a state visit to Indonesia so that he could be hands-on demonstrates that there's a realization this time that this has just gone on too far, and there needs to be a curtailing of the criminality immediately, as well as making sure that it doesn't happen again.
Well, joining us now to understand the outbreak of violence is Dr. Yolande Buka. She's from the Institute of Security Studies. Thank you for joining us here on Talk Africa. Also standing by for us in Johannesburg, I have Jean-Pierre Misago from the African Center for Migration and Society at Wits University, as well as Pierre Pigot. He's the project director at the Crisis Group Southern Africa. To you both, thank you for joining us here on the program. Jean-Pierre, I'll start off with you now. The South African government had earlier on called this, acts of criminality, Afrophobia. They've now called it xenophobia. First of all, can you help us understand exactly what is going on there in South Africa? Why the retraction from the government, and what exactly is it?
I mean, what we see happening now is not really new. It's been happening since even before 2008. Of course, we saw the unprecedented way in 2008, but it has not stopped. It continued happening, and in the past, the government has denied and has called just pure criminality. And we've been consistently saying that it's beyond the criminality. When people systematically attack others because of where they come from, and their message is very clear to remove them from communities, that's beyond the criminality, that's hate crime, that's xenophobic violence. So what we see today is no different. The difference from the government position now is that they're now moving from the pure criminality to Afrophobia. I don't know what informs that approach or that hypothesis, because it doesn't really pass the empirical test, because we have seen evidence that Pakistanis and Bangladeshis have been attacked in similar cases. So it's not only Afrophobia, it's about everybody who is in that specific space, every foreigner who lives in those spaces and who are seen as a threat to somebody's lives or livelihoods.
All right, Dr. Booker, this is a sense of xenophobia now in South Africa, and as Jean-Pierre says, though, it has moved beyond just mere criminality. What is exacerbating the situation?
I think you have a situation in South Africa, and I'm sure our experts in South Africa can talk a little bit more about this, but you have a combination of frustration from the part of the youth in terms of employment. We're talking about a situation where foreigners are associated with not only high levels of unemployment, they're taking all the jobs apparently, but you also have a situation where they think that criminality is associated with foreigners, when in reality these are myths, and the data proves that.
Pierre Pigot, do you accept, do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I think the situation, as Jean-Pierre points out, is not a new one. Issues and attitudes towards foreign nationals have been negative amongst a percentage of the South African population, and there are no class, gender or race biases there. Rich white women, according to the survey data, are as likely to have negative attitudes towards foreigners as poor black men. But we need to make the distinction here around the spatial politics, and Jean-Pierre has hinted at that as well, that it's really about the locations in which this is taking place. And it's also important to understand this within the context of the broader levels of violent crime in South Africa and vulnerability of minority and vulnerable groups here. This is a country where violence still remains, and I add in parenthesis, a legitimate problem-solving mechanism for certain individuals. So it's very important that while we see a particular group being targeted in this situation, and as has been said, it's not a new phenomenon, we see this inside a broader context of challenges around crime and social economic competition for resources.
All right,
Can I add one simple thing to say that it doesn't have to be either or. It can be xenophobic at the same time criminal. Surely it's a crime to attack and to kill somebody into their shops. But is there a motivation behind that criminality, that crime, criminal action? And that motivation is what we need to understand. From what the people say about their intentions to remove foreigners from their locations, it's definitely xenophobic. So it doesn't have to be either or. It can be both, and it is both in this case.
There are 1.2 million foreign workers, though, in South Africa. About 4% of jobs. They only take about 4% of jobs. Is this really about, foreigners taking away the jobs of locals?
I don't think it is, but this is a myth that is not unique to South Africa, and I think for me as a comparativist, this is what needs to be highlighted. What you see in South Africa is not different from what you hear in Europe that is facing an economic crisis at the moment, or in North America, for instance, where Latin Americans are being singled out as the reason for high levels of unemployment. They're taking the jobs. This is a myth that is quite global. I think what makes a difference in South Africa, as has been pointed out, is the level of criminality and the fact that violence is seen as a legitimate tool to solve problems. And then you also have the point of impunity. The ability to commit such crimes since 2008 and probably before, and being able to get away with it. The government needs to tackle this level of impunity and try to understand where the violence comes from and gather intelligence in terms of what are the dynamics, where are those types of violence taking place. I think that's what's important.
Pierre Pigo, I can see you shaking, nodding your head there. This is not a situation that is unique to South Africa alone. The United States, for instance, has about 45 million migrants.
Yes, I mean, and also the figures and the statistics we're playing with need to be looked at with a certain amount of skepticism. I think one of the issues here is that we are not sure about the numbers of undocumented migrants in this country. But I should hasten to add that the violence doesn't discriminate between documented and undocumented. And so that issue really is a red herring when people talk about this is a problem with undocumented migrants. But the broader issue around competition for work is a factor in some situations. But elsewhere we've seen migrants have been responsible for generating employment in South Africa. So it's not an even spread across the board. Yolanda is absolutely right. We need to understand the particular dynamics of how conflict is playing out. And this requires a very different approach in terms of understanding the spatial geography of violence and the factors that feed into that. South Africa has had experience of trying to understand this before. In the early 1990s, during the transition here, which was a very violent period in which there are some similarities in terms of where some of the perpetrators came from, and we've seen this recently around some of the dynamics with hostile violence, right. It was possible to actually map how these things unfolded. And so certainly crime intelligence and a response from government in the criminal justice system, and we've seen, I think, a slight improvement, but it's really, so far it's been really too late that they've been responding to these issues, but at least we see some movement on that front now.
All right, Jean-Pierre?
One quick thing I wanted to add is that, as you said, xenophobia is not unique to South Africa, and is not unique to poor or African countries. We have evidence that xenophobia exists in rich and countries in Europe and America. What seems to be unique in South Africa is that more and more communities are willing to express those feelings through mass collective violence. And that's what is a big concern at the moment. Because xenophobia is not the same thing as violence. Xenophobia is an attitude that people have towards others. And I believe we all have neighbors we don't like. I have one. But we don't always attack them. So as Yolanda was saying, we need to understand the dynamics, the pathways between attitudes and violence. Right. And before we do that, we'll never be able to design interventions that can stop that kind of violence.
Jean-Pierre, the one question, though, that's coming out is that this is not the first time that xenophobic attacks have happened in South Africa, but it did take, almost 3 weeks before the first response from government. I mean, if the government knew the extent of damage this can cause, 62 people lost their lives in 2008, why was there a rather slow response?
That's what we tried to understand, why the response was not as quick as it should have been. And we tried to understand what was going on, and what we saw was that they didn't take the situation seriously. They thought it was just a few people, a few criminals, as they called them, before the situation got out of hand. But what worries me is that we didn't learn anything from the situation in 2008. Violence continued, it never stopped. And even today, we are seeing the same response, the same approach. It's like we haven't learned anything from that situation. The police is still doing the same thing it did in 2008. One example is the approach is evacuation. Instead of protecting people where they are in their livelihoods, the approach is let's go, let's move. And that, for me, is playing in the hands of the perpetrators. The intention is clear, to remove people from the communities. And the police come, and then let's go. That's what the perpetrators want. They have won. and we are helping them to achieve their goals. And the Home Affairs Minister comes and repatriates people, or deport people, or facilitate what they call voluntary repatriation, which is not really voluntary when you don't have another choice.
All right.
So briefly, we haven't learned anything from the past, and as it is now, I wouldn't be sure that the current responses are going to have any different effects.
All right, we'll continue with this discussion. Dr. Yolan Buka, Jean-Pierre Misago, and Pierre Pigot, do stay with us. We'll return to this discussion in a moment. We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, we'll delve even further into this discussion. Do stay with us.
Government continues to work closely with foreign missions in South Africa to ensure that displaced persons receive all necessary support. Perpetrators are being arrested, charged, and prosecuted. Government reiterates that attacks on any fellow human beings and destruction of property, as well as looting, are criminal offenses and will not be tolerated.
That was South African Minister of Home Affairs Malusi Gigaba detailing the efforts to address the xenophobic violence in the country. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, while the government has certainly stepped up efforts to stamp out xenophobic attacks in South Africa, the reality is that hundreds of people, both local and foreign, have been directly affected by the violence. And this is what a few of them had to say.
Why do we hate ourselves so much? Why do we hate ourselves as black people? If indeed poverty and inequality was the cause of the murder of our black people, why then are we not attacking the peers, the Oppenheimers, the Sasson, and all the white monopoly capitalists?
Perhaps they have forgotten so quickly that South Africans also live in Nigeria and also have huge investments like MTN. Ironically, no Nigerian has attacked MTN, DSTV, ShopRite, and many more businesses that are owned by South African companies. One therefore wonders the justification for the xenophobic attacks against Nigerians and other foreigners who live and do business in South Africa.
My experience has changed my view of what Joburg is, and we thought it was the rainbow colors and the rainbow, but I don't see it. I just see I don't see the togetherness of a nation.
And I will never ever come back to this country. I'll never step my foot on this country again.
We've been almost unable to trust any friend, any black South African friend, because we don't know what they think, what they have in their mind, because we know it's something they've always in their mind all these days.
It is time that the South African government addressed the problem head on, rather than shifting the blame on small shopkeepers and illegal immigrants.
We're continuing our discussion now on the xenophobic attacks down in South Africa. I still have with me Dr. Yolan Buka. She's from the Institute of Security Studies. Jean-Pierre Misago and Pierre Pigot are joining us from Johannesburg. Dr. Buka, let me just go back to what Pierre Pigot said earlier on about President Zuma's comments on other countries allowing their citizens to flee into South Africa because of their own economic difficulties. What's your take on that statement?
It's a very difficult line to walk. On one hand, as he mentioned, you do not want to say it's a justification for violence. But at the same time, what are our African leaders and governments doing about the conditions within their countries? This is the same migration pattern that you see in Southern Africa. You also see a very similar one from Western Africa to European countries. And when people die, when people are attacked, those governments are silent. What are the conditions in those particular countries that lead people not to seek new opportunities, but to literally flee places of violence or economic stagnation, young people who have no economic opportunities? And when you have that tipping point of a large number of youth unemployed, you have security concern, whether domestically or wherever those young people go.
Jean-Pierre, the continent as well has a role to play in this whole issue.
Yes, it does. It has a role to play, but it will be not necessarily correct to think that development is going to stop migration. That's not going to happen. But we would like to see a migration where people have a choice to say, I'm migrating because I'm going to try to improve my socioeconomic conditions, not because people are running away from abject poverty or human rights abuse or persecution. The refugee and asylum seekers, really, African countries should take responsibility. All the conflicts, the political issues going on should really be tackled to prevent people from moving in those kind of situations. But the idea that development will stop migration, that I think it's not really correct, because we have people coming into our countries from richer countries, because they feel they can fulfill their potentials in smaller or less developed countries. The idea, what I'm trying to get at is that whether people are here for different reasons, but there is nothing that can justify the way they are being treated right now. Nothing can justify violence against others. That's the mission we're trying to say. It should be seen as beyond the migration issue. This is a human rights issue, and this is a government losing its authority and power to be able to enforce the rule of law in the communities. And in our papers, we say sometimes that when political exclusion of others make political and economic sense, everybody is at risk. For the first time, we have seen people in the cities getting threatened by messages and SMSs. At VITS, we had to cancel a class because students couldn't come, couldn't use public transport because of the fear. So it's no longer about those poor migrants living in informal settlements in poor townships. It's coming to us. So we should all be afraid when our countries are not able to perform their duties of protecting everyone and to uphold the rule of law.
Yolanda, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, I think the series of comments that he just made are absolutely right. We can't think that this is only a migration issue. Why are people flocking to South Africa? South Africa is a wonderful country. We've seen during the last World Cup how welcoming of a people South Africans can be. But if you look at the countries around South Africa, and a lot of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, there is some migrations between the countries, but the land of opportunity on the continent, in some cases, are countries like Kenya, for instance, or countries like South Africa that provide economic opportunity. So I think we can't discount that, but at the same time, as migrants, like everywhere in the world, there needs to be a certain level of confidence that once you arrive somewhere, you will be protected the same way citizens are protected. And security in South Africa is a concern. So as we see this violence erupting against migrants, we also need to take a look at what kind of violence is happening in South Africa with continued impunity. And this, in terms of the rule of law, is also something that needs to be discussed from the government's part. All
right, let me just broaden this discussion a little bit wider and look at the reaction, though, from Africa. Pierre Pigo, one country, Nigeria, though, I mean, although there have been a lot of comments from other countries, but Nigeria in particular reacted by recalling, their envoys and being rather angry about the whole situation. Is that, though, indicative of a continent-wide indictment of the South African government's failure to stop these xenophobic attacks?
I'm not so sure. My sense of the reaction from the outgoing Nigerian foreign minister and the unfortunate response to that from South Africa's own Department of International Relations and Cooperation rather elevated the interchange to something that it really wasn't. I mean, we know that there have been ongoing tensions between Nigeria and South Africa at a number of different levels, and these have played out within the media, but in the diplomatic arena and so forth. So I think it's a bit of a storm in a teacup in terms of that, but I do think the general reaction from the continent has been much more robust than we have ever seen before, and I think that this is a useful thing for South Africa to take notice of how others view it on the continent. At one level, of course, it's been conscious about how it engages in the continent as it spreads its wings as one of the continental superpowers. But it really has to take notice of how others are perceiving it, and I think it has to work very hard with those countries in order to find mutual solutions to this situation, because what has happened here in this country is not unique to the situation on the continent. We've seen several other incidents across the continent where nationals of neighboring countries, for example, are expelled en masse. So let's not make this about South Africa. Let's look at the broader implications as they fit into our continental and our regional standards and how best we can move towards adhering to those within the framework of human rights which this continent adheres to.
All right, Dr. Booker, we're going to wind up in a moment, but let's just look at the solution to this, because this is not, as we said earlier, not the first time, not the second, not the third time that this has happened. How do you deal with this situation? How do we ensure that we avoid a recurrence?
I think one of the ways to avoid this is give proper information to the people. Have some sort of community approach for that the population understands that the migrants are not enemies. They're not taking your jobs. They're actually contributing to the diversity, contributing to the political strength of your country. The second thing is to continue to fight impunity in South Africa. How do we prosecute such crimes, to make examples, to make sure that people understand that once you engage in these types of violence, you will get punished. The third is, as I mentioned earlier, understanding the dynamics of this violence. Where is it taking place? Why and at what time is this taking place? And finally, a strong and robust reaction and response from the government in South Africa. And I think the point is well taken, but from other leaders in Africa, where this is also taking place periodically.
All right, we'll leave it there for the moment. Dr. Yolan Booker from the Institute of Security Studies with me here in Nairobi. Thank you. And also in Johannesburg, Jean-Pierre Misago from the African Center for Migration and Society at Wits University, and Pierre Pigo, Project Director at the Crisis Group Southern Africa. To you all, thank you for joining us here on Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshal in Nairobi. Goodbye.